It is a Saturday afternoon, April 26th, 2025. Somewhere in the world, a cargo ship the length of 4 football fields is sliding silently through a narrow ribbon of water in the Egyptian desert, paying its toll, as ships have done on this route for over 150 years, carrying oil or grain or electronics or automobiles from Asia toward Europe and beyond. The Suez Canal is working. The world's maritime plumbing is functioning. And then a social media post changes everything. American ships, both military and commercial, should be allowed to travel free of charge through the Panama and Suez Canals. Those canals would not exist without the United States of America. Those words, posted by President Donald Trump on Truth Social on April 26, 2025, detonated like a depth charge across the global maritime world, across Egypt, across the diplomatic community, across the shipping industry, and across every nation that depends on the Suez Canal to move its goods. Within hours, the Egyptian political establishment was in open revolt. Within days, China had inserted itself into the controversy in ways that revealed something profound about the shifting architecture of global power. And within weeks, Egypt was quietly accelerating negotiations to purchase a fleet of advanced Chinese submarines. All of that from a social media post. Tonight, we are going to walk through exactly what happened, why it matters, what it reveals about Trump's foreign policy doctrine, and what it means for a waterway that 12% of global maritime trade passes through every single year. Because this is not just a story about canal fees. This is a story about sovereignty, about history, about the US-Egypt alliance cracking under pressure, about China's relentless advance into America's traditional sphere of influence, and about what happens when the world's most powerful nation starts treating its allies the way it treats its adversaries. Stay with us. To understand why Trump's post hit Egypt like a thunderbolt, you have to understand what the Suez Canal actually means to Egyptians. Not economically, we'll get to that, but historically, emotionally, nationally. The Suez Canal is a national symbol in Egypt, representing its success in supplanting the British colonial rulers who once controlled the waterway and its revenue. The digging of the canal by forced labor, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of peasants, has become a deeply personal part of how many Egyptians conceive of their nation. The Suez Canal was inaugurated in 1869, with Egypt holding over half the capital of the founding company. The remaining shares were divided among European powers, including France, Britain, Austria, and Russia. The United States, and this is important, had essentially no role in building it. The canal was a French engineering project dug by Egyptian labor, owned partly by Egypt and partly by European nations. The United States was, in 1869, a country that had just finished fighting its own civil war, still enslaved human beings, and barely had a functioning transcontinental railroad. One of Egypt's most recognizable pro-government journalists suggested someone should remind Trump that the Suez Canal was officially inaugurated in 1869 when you had just ended your civil war, you still owned slaves, and you barely had an operational railway. Then, on July 26, 1956, a date that every Egyptian schoolchild knows, President Gamal Abdel Nasser stood before a roaring crowd in Alexandria and announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal. He was ending foreign control over Egypt's most important national asset. What followed was a crisis that nearly started a world war. Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to try to take the canal back by force. The United States, under President Eisenhower, forced them to withdraw. That moment, when America stood with Egypt against European colonialism, is the foundation of a bilateral relationship that has lasted nearly 7 decades. So when Donald Trump posted on April 26th that the canal wouldn't exist without the United States of America and demanded that American ships travel through it for free, He was not making a trade argument. He was, in Egyptian eyes, erasing history, claiming ownership of something built by Egyptian blood, and doing it in the crudest possible way. A social media post issued on a Saturday with no diplomatic preparation, no conversation with Cairo, no context, just a demand. Saeed Sadiq, a political analyst specializing in Middle East affairs, described Trump's comments as signaling a shift in U.S.-Egyptian relations at their lowest ebb in decades. Let's talk about the economics of what Trump was actually demanding, because the numbers tell a story of their own. According to Al Jazeera, U.S. traffic accounts for about 10 to 20% of the volume on the Suez Canal and generates fees of $400,000 to $700,000 per vessel transit for the Egyptian government's Suez Canal Authority. Waiving those fees entirely would represent a significant blow to Egypt's finances. But here is the critical context that makes Trump's demand even more tone-deaf. On April 16th, just 10 days before Trump's post, the Suez Canal Authority chairman, Osama Rabi, revealed a 61% drop in canal revenues in 2024 due to regional instability, down to $3.99 billion from $10.25 billion in 2023. Read that again. Egypt's canal revenues had already collapsed by more than 60%. They had gone from over $10 billion to under $4 billion in a single year. And the reason for that collapse was the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, attacks that had driven most major shipping companies to abandon the Suez route entirely and sail the long way around Africa instead, adding weeks and millions of dollars in fuel costs to every voyage. That income funds everything from food subsidies to arms procurement, said Mohammed Nabil El-Bendari, a political researcher at Interregional for Strategic Analysis in Cairo. So any suggestion the canal should be open to U.S. warships free of charge strikes a nerve. Egypt is a country of over 100 million people. It is a country where food subsidies, government-supported bread prices, are not a luxury. They are a social contract. They are what stands between stability and chaos. The Suez Canal is how Egypt funds that contract. And it was already bleeding out from Houthi attacks when Trump demanded it give away what remained of its revenue for free. If the Egyptian government yielded to U.S. pressure, it could open the door for other countries to demand similar treatment. This would strip Egypt of what's left of its Suez Canal revenues, which have fallen by 60% over the past year, amounting to a loss of around $7 billion. That alone could trigger renewed turmoil in Egypt's foreign exchange market, put new pressure on the Egyptian pound, and potentially lead to further currency devaluations. Now let's look at Trump's historical claim, because it is not just politically provocative, it is factually wrong. And that wrongness matters. The Suez Canal was built by French engineers in the 19th century and has been controlled by the Egyptian government. The United States did not finance it. The United States did not build it. The United States did not administer it. The only moment in which the United States played a decisive role in the canal's history was in 1956, when Eisenhower forced the British, French, and Israelis to abandon their invasion, a moment in which the U.S. sided with Egypt, not against it. The Panama Canal is a different case. The Panama Canal was built by the United States from 1904 to 1914, with thousands of local workers dying during construction. The U.S. administered the canal for most of the 20th century before handing control to Panama in 1999, a handover that Trump has repeatedly called a big mistake. Trump's demand for free passage through the Panama Canal has its own complicated legal and political dimensions. But conflating the Panama Canal, where the U.S. did play a foundational role, with the Suez Canal, where it did not, was, as Egyptian commentators put it immediately, a demonstration of breathtaking historical ignorance. Ali Eldin Hilal, a professor of political science at Cairo University, slammed Trump's comments as confrontational and void of historical truths. A senior member of Egypt's Senate Foreign Affairs Committee affirmed that only Egypt is responsible for securing and protecting the Suez Canal, and that the revenues generated from canal transit fees are a legitimate sovereign resource backing the national economy and serving Egyptian citizens, and shall not be impaired under any pretext or justification. Here is where the story takes a turn that goes far beyond canal fees. Because the reaction to Trump's post was not just Egyptian, it was Chinese. China's foreign ministry spokesman, Lin Jian, speaking from Beijing, said his government firmly supports the Egyptian government and people in safeguarding their sovereignty and legitimate rights and interests, and opposes any acts or words of bullying. He added, Egypt's sovereignty over and management and operation rights of the Suez Canal are indisputable. Think about the choreography of that moment. The United States, Egypt's primary military partner, the country that has provided over $50 billion in military assistance to Cairo since 1978, had just publicly threatened Egyptian sovereignty over its most important national asset. And within days, China stepped in as Egypt's defender. China called U.S. behavior bullying. China stood publicly with Cairo against Washington. This sharp contrast between competing visions of the U.S.-Egypt relationship immediately created uncertainty about the future of one of America's most strategically important Middle Eastern partnerships. Behind closed doors, Egyptian security figures interpreted Trump's remarks as a signal that traditional U.S. guarantees can no longer be taken for granted. A senior source close to Egypt's arms procurement community told the Washington Times that the country is finalizing plans to replace its aging Chinese Romeo-class submarines, last upgraded in the 1980s, with a fleet of at least 12 modern stealth-capable vessels. 12 modern stealth submarines, negotiated with China and other suppliers. In direct response to the anxiety created by Trump's Suez Canal demand, al-Benderi said that Trump's Suez remarks raised three concerns: economic risk if they become policy, a dangerous precedent for future demands, and a direct affront to national sovereignty. They amplified a drive already underway. To fully understand why this moment was so explosive, you need to understand the broader context of U.S.-Egypt relations in the spring of 2025. Because Trump's canal demand did not land on neutral ground. It landed on a relationship that was already under severe strain. The past 100 days of Trump's administration had revealed a growing rift between Cairo and Washington over the future of Gaza and free passage through the Suez Canal. Trump had actively pressured both Egypt and Jordan to accept displaced Palestinians from Gaza, a proposal that was robustly rejected by both countries. Egypt's opposition to Trump's Gaza plan was not merely diplomatic, it was existential. Accepting millions of Palestinian refugees from Gaza would permanently alter Egypt's demographics, destabilize the Sinai Peninsula, and effectively end, in Egyptian eyes, any possibility of a two-state solution that would allow Palestinians to return to their homeland. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi drew a hard line. The Arab League backed him. The proposal died, but not before leaving a deep wound in the U.S.-Egypt relationship. Then came the Sinai Liberation Day speech. On April 25th, one day before Trump's canal post, President Sisi stood before his nation and called on Trump to play his expected role in ensuring Palestinians remain in their homeland. It was a pointed public rebuke. And the very next day, Trump fired back with his canal demand. Analysts noted that Trump's stance was also tied to growing tensions visible in several incidents. Egypt's rejection of the Gaza plan, President el-Sisi's cancellation of a Washington visit in February, and joint Egypt-China Air Force drills that began in mid-April and continued into early May 2025. Egypt, a country that gets 80% of its major arms imports from the United States, was conducting joint military exercises with China at the same moment that Trump was demanding free passage through the Suez Canal. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The U.S. notification to Egypt of impending military aid reductions starting in 2026 appears to be a retaliatory move by Trump for Egypt's refusal to support the Gaza proposal. This clash has revealed diverging priorities. Egypt is focused on Palestinian sovereignty, while Trump favors a transactional approach involving displacement and coercive leverage. This friction threatens to erode the foundational principles of their defense cooperation, established during the 1979 Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords, the framework that ended the state of war between Egypt and Israel, the foundation of 4 decades of Middle Eastern stability. That framework, and the U.S.-Egypt military relationship that underpins it, is now under stress from multiple directions simultaneously. Egypt's official response to Trump's canal demand was, on its surface, silence. Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr Abdel Atti stated that it's best not to respond to Trump's post, a response that was praised by those attending a national dialogue meeting. But silence is not the same as acceptance, and underneath that official quiet, Egypt's political class erupted. Alaa Mubarak, the son of former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, asked Trump to wise up and told him enough with this nonsense. Egypt's civil democratic movement, which includes several of the country's political opposition parties, accused Trump of a lack of historical awareness and unacceptable arrogance. The Egyptian people consider the Suez Canal a red line and will never accept any infringement on Egypt's sovereignty and national security, the group said. Diplomacy, analysts noted, often follows one of 2 paths: a firm rebuttal or deliberate silence to avoid legitimizing reckless statements. In this case, Egypt chose silence, not as submission, but as what one analyst described as strategic restraint, while warning that repeated provocations might necessitate a shift in Cairo's response strategy. A second trajectory, though less probable, involves a sharper break. If Trump intensifies demands and cuts aid, surging nationalist sentiment over Gaza and the Suez Canal could push Egypt to risk expelling U.S. naval forces, marking a decisive break in military coordination with knock-on effects across the Horn of Africa. Expelling U.S. naval forces from Egypt, from the country that provides the most direct access to the Suez Canal for the U.S. Navy's East Coast Fleet. This would be a seismic shift in American strategic positioning in the Middle East, and it is now on the table, according to analysts, as a possible outcome of continued U.S. pressure. Let's talk about what Trump was actually trying to accomplish, because there is a strategic logic to his demand, even if the execution was extraordinarily clumsy. A senior U.S. administration official indicated that Trump is seeking economic concessions from Egypt and Europe in return for American military efforts to secure navigation through the Suez Canal, a strategy revealed in leaked text messages discussing a series of U.S. airstrikes on Yemen, which the U.S. launched in March. This is the core of Trump's argument. The United States has been spending enormous military resources bombing Houthi targets in Yemen, specifically to protect Red Sea shipping lanes and restore traffic to the Suez Canal. American aircraft, American missiles, American sailors, all deployed to suppress a militant group whose attacks have cost Egypt $7 billion in canal revenue. Trump's position, stripped to its essentials, is, you owe us. We're protecting your canal, and you should compensate us by letting our ships through for free. There is a certain internal logic to that framing, but it ignores several crucial facts. First, Egyptians view U.S. operations in Yemen as the cause, not the solution, of the canal's shipping losses. Egypt has also not received any formal request for an exemption from transit fees. The Houthi attacks began as a response to the Gaza war, a war that the United States has been supporting diplomatically and militarily. From Cairo's perspective, American policy in Gaza created the Houthi threat. American bombs in Yemen have not yet solved it. And now America wants to be paid for its incomplete solution to a problem it helped create. Second, U.S.-flagged vessels make up only a minimal share of Suez Canal traffic, less than 1% of the world's shipping fleet in 2023. American ships are overwhelmingly registered under flags of convenience in Liberia, Panama, and the Marshall Islands, where costs are lower. The actual revenue impact of genuinely waiving fees only for US-flagged military and commercial vessels might be far smaller than the political firestorm suggests. But if American-flagged were interpreted to include American-owned ships under foreign flags, a category that represents a significant chunk of global shipping, the financial impact would be catastrophic. Trump offered, as compensation for free canal passage, the US bombing campaign against Houthi rebels in Yemen. Egypt had not asked for that campaign. Egypt had not been consulted about it. And Egypt was skeptical it was working. Now let's talk about the broader pattern, because the Suez Canal demand did not come in isolation. It came as part of a series of Trump foreign policy moves that collectively amount to something unprecedented in American history. The open, aggressive assertion that the United States is entitled to special treatment from every country in the world, regardless of international law, historical relationships, or diplomatic norms. Trump's remarks are the latest in a series of proposals for the United States to assert greater access or ownership over key global assets. Earlier, he spoke of making Canada the 51st U.S. state, annexing Greenland, controlling the Gaza Strip, and gaining ownership of Ukraine's rare earth minerals. Canada, Greenland, Gaza, Ukraine, Panama, the Suez Canal. Each of these, in a different administration, would be a diplomatic crisis in its own right. Under Trump, they arrive as a cascade, each one absorbing so much attention that the previous one barely has time to settle before the next lands. The Trump remarks also come shortly before a regional tour in May that includes visits to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, countries with strategic interests in both Egypt and the Suez Canal. Trump traveled to Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha, collecting arms deals and investment pledges worth hundreds of billions of dollars. He was celebrated in Gulf capitals with ceremony and spectacle. Egypt watched from the margins, a U.S. ally for nearly 50 years, simultaneously being lectured about canal fees and pressured to absorb Palestinian refugees. Reports also emerged that Saudi Arabia was considering offering the United States a military base on the Red Sea islands of Tiran and Sanafir, a move that would enable Washington to keep a watchful eye over arms smuggling from Iran to Lebanon and Gaza, but one that would undermine Egypt's sovereignty over the Suez Canal. Egypt controls access to the northern end of the Red Sea, a U.S. military base on islands that Egypt considers within its strategic zone. Positioned there at Saudi invitation without Egyptian consent, would represent another direct challenge to Cairo's regional authority. The layers of pressure accumulating on Egypt from its ostensible ally are extraordinary. What does China's intervention in this story tell us? Because it is worth examining carefully. China's foreign ministry spokesman, calling U.S. behavior toward Egypt bullying, was not speaking spontaneously. This was a calculated, deliberate diplomatic intervention. China saw an opening, a moment when the United States had alienated a strategically vital Middle Eastern ally and walked directly through it. It remains to be seen whether Trump's further pressure on the Suez Canal will push Egypt closer to China by expanding their bilateral cooperation, particularly in the military sphere. Egypt is already a member of BRICS, the economic bloc that China leads, alongside Russia, Brazil, India, and others. Egypt has been conducting joint military exercises with China. Egypt is now negotiating to buy Chinese submarines. And China is publicly defending Egyptian sovereignty against American demands. Egypt may be engaging in tactical maneuvering, deepening ties with China and Russia, not to replace the U.S., but to create strategic leverage and reduce vulnerability to American pressure. But tactical maneuvering has a way of becoming structural reality. The more Egypt diversifies its military relationships, the less leverage Washington has over Cairo. And the less leverage Washington has over Cairo, the less it can count on Egypt's cooperation on the issues that actually matter to American strategic interests: Israeli security, counterterrorism, Libyan stability, Red Sea navigation. The irony at the heart of Trump's Suez Canal demand is this: the very pressure he applied to extract economic concessions from Egypt is driving Egypt toward the one country, China, that America most wants to keep out of the Middle East. Let's talk about what ordinary Egyptians are experiencing. Because behind all of this geopolitics are 100 million people trying to survive an economy under enormous strain. Mahmoud Amer, who owns a plumbing business in Cairo, expressed concerns that Trump's tariffs would drive up already high costs of living in Egypt. You have no idea how many Egyptians, particularly in construction and various kinds of factories, have their lives upturned by fluctuations in import costs and tariffs, he said. Factories will lay off dozens of workers until expensive parts arrive. Egypt imports enormous quantities of wheat, most of its manufactured goods, and significant amounts of fuel. Disruptions to global trade, whether from tariffs, from Houthi attacks, or from diplomatic crises that affect Egypt's access to international financial systems, translate directly into price increases that hit ordinary Egyptians hardest. The Egyptian pound has already been significantly devalued in recent years. Inflation has been running high. Food prices have been a constant source of social stress. Saeed Abdelhai, a 57-year-old farm manager in Cairo, said of Trump, "It is more important than ever that we as a nation stand up to his madness and prove that we will not be ordered around or give up our wealth and dignity so easily." That sentiment, the sense that Egypt's dignity is being challenged, that its sovereignty is under attack, that the canal built by Egyptian blood is being claimed by a foreign power, is not manufactured. It is real. It runs deep in a country with living memory of colonialism, of the 1956 crisis, of the decades of struggle to control the waterway that finances the nation's most basic social contract. Egyptian politicians and journalists who have publicly defended the canal's sovereignty have found themselves aligned with public opinion in ways that are rare in a country where press freedom is constrained. When pro-government media figures call Trump's demands a dangerous transgression, when the son of Hosni Mubarak tells the American president to wise up, you are witnessing something unusual, a moment of genuine national unity in Egypt, forged in the heat of American pressure. Where does all of this leave us? 3 scenarios appear possible. In the first, the most likely, Egypt continues tactical maneuvering, keeping its U.S. military relationship intact while quietly deepening ties with China, Russia, and others, using those relationships as leverage against Washington's most extreme demands. In the second, a sharper break occurs. Trump intensifies demands, cuts aid further, and Egypt responds by expelling U.S. naval forces, a seismic development for American strategic positioning across the entire Middle East and Horn of Africa. In the third, a pragmatic détente. Washington acknowledges Egypt's multipolar orientation and finds common ground on Gaza reconstruction and Red Sea security. But Trump's transactional style and Sisi's emphasis on sovereignty make that reconciliation difficult. The Suez Canal itself remains open. American ships, military and commercial, continue to transit it, paying the standard fees that every other nation pays. Egypt has not received any formal diplomatic request for a fee exemption. The crisis, triggered by Trump's Truth Social post, has not yet produced a formal policy change on either side. But something has shifted, something that a social media post cannot unshift. The sense in Cairo that Washington can no longer be taken for granted. The sense in Beijing that the United States is creating openings for Chinese influence throughout the Middle East. The sense in every maritime capital, from Singapore to Rotterdam, that the global rules governing the world's most important shipping lanes are now subject to the whims of a Truth Social post. An Egyptian legal expert warned the international community to stand firm in defending international laws and conventions and take serious steps to safeguard the legal bases for navigation. Thank you for watching.